In the previous episode, we witnessed the slow crumbling of Egypt's inner world. We saw the faith that sustained the pharaoh's throne shaken from within, the sacred tombs desecrated by the hands of their own guardians, and divine power fragment into dynastic disputes and deadly conspiracies. Egypt, once believed to be eternal, began to bleed from its own wounds. But what happened when the enemies who had always been outside the borders realized that the giant was weakened? The story that unfolds now is no longer one of self-destruction, but one of a slow and painful agony under the dominion of foreign empires. This is the twilight of the gods. This is the story of the Nile's last gasp. The internal chaos was reflected in the political fragmentation of Egypt. Around 1069 BC, the country split in two. In the north, a dynasty based in Tanis ruled Lower Egypt. In the south, the high priest of Amun in Thebes ruled Upper Egypt with almost absolute power. This period of fragmentation, known as the Third Intermediate Period, lasted more than 400 years and was marked by constant disputes between rival dynasties, often of foreign origin. Egypt, once unified, was now a mosaic of warlords. The Libyans, who had settled in the delta as mercenaries, became a dominant political force. Sheshenq I founded the 22nd dynasty and even sacked Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, an event recorded in the Bible. But Libyan power did not bring stability. On the contrary, competition between Libyan, Nubian factions and local dynasties only accelerated the disintegration of the kingdom. The throne became a prize to be taken by force, not a seat of divine right. From the south, a powerful new player emerged, the Kingdom of Kush in Nubia. The Nubian kings, deeply devoted to Amun, saw themselves as the rightful heirs to the Pharaonic tradition. Around 730 BC, King Piye, an ambitious and religious ruler, decided to intervene. He led an army north, conquered city after city, and restored the unity of Egypt under his rule. The 25th dynasty, the Nubian dynasty, had begun. Piye restored the temples, revived the ancient rituals, and attempted to return Egypt to its former glory. But the world around them was changing, and the threat approaching Egypt did not come from the Nile, but from the east. A new empire, fueled by iron and blood, was about to seal the fate of the valley. The Assyrian Empire, with its iron army and legendary cruelty, was expanding rapidly. The Assyrians had conquered Babylon, destroyed the Kingdom of Israel, and now turned their eyes to Egypt. In 671 BC, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded the country. Pharaoh Taharka resisted bravely, but was defeated and forced to flee south. The Assyrians took Memphis and looted its temples. But what happened in 664 BC under the reign of King Ashurnapal was of unprecedented brutality. Enraged by a rebellion supported by the Nubians, Ashurnapal launched a campaign of terror against Egypt. His troops marched to Thebes, the sacred city that had never been conquered. They razed it. The temples of Karnak and Luxor were desecrated, their statues toppled, and their treasures looted. Assyrian chronicles boast of bringing immeasurable riches back to Nineveh. The burning of Thebes was a psychological trauma from which Egypt never recovered. The city that represented the permanence of divine order had been reduced to ashes. The gods, it seemed, had abandoned their home. Despite the trauma of the Assyrian invasion, Egypt showed remarkable resilience. A Delta prince, Psammetichus I, who initially served as a vassal of the Assyrians, realized that the Assyrian Empire was weakened by conflicts on other borders. He acted with intelligence and patience. Psammetichus hired Greek and Carian mercenaries, experienced warriors loyal to their pay, and formed an army that allowed him to gradually expel the Assyrians from Egypt. In 656 BC, he was recognized as sole pharaoh, beginning the 26th dynasty, the Saite period. It was the twilight of a glory, a last glimmer before night. The Saite dynasty represented a final, brilliant Egyptian renaissance.
For about 140 years, the Saite pharaohs restored internal stability, revitalized trade, and rebuilt temples. Pharaoh Necho II, successor to Psammetichus, began the construction of a canal that would link the Nile to the Red Sea, a visionary project that preceded the Suez Canal by more than 2,000 years. But there was something artificial about this renaissance. The Saite pharaohs constantly looked to the past. They imitated the art of the Old Kingdom with such meticulous precision that even today, archaeologists have difficulty dating some statues. They revived forgotten titles and ceremonies, as if trying to convince themselves and the world that Egypt was still the unchanging power of the past. However, the reality was different. The world of the 6th century BC was unrecognizable. Iron had replaced bronze. Greek philosophy flourished, challenging ancient mythical traditions. The Phoenicians sailed the seas with an alphabet that would revolutionize communication. Egypt, in its quest for the past, was losing touch with the future. On the eastern horizon, a new power, Persia, was rapidly rising. Cyrus the Great had created an empire that stretched from Asia Minor to India. His son, Cambyses II, turned his attention to Egypt, the last great independent kingdom of the Near East. In 525 BC, Cambyses crossed the Sinai. Egypt's fate would be decided not by its gods, but by a masterstroke of psychological warfare.
The Battle of Pelusium, which sealed Egypt's fate, was decided not only by military force, but by brutal psychological cunning. According to the Greek historian Polyaenus, the Persians placed sacred Egyptian animals, cats, ibises, dogs, at the forefront of their army. The Egyptian soldiers, refusing to harm the divine creatures, hesitated. This hesitation was fatal. They were massacred. Pharaoh Psammetichus III was captured and taken in chains to Susa. For the first time in 3,000 years, Egypt was not an independent kingdom, but a province of a foreign empire. For almost 200 years, under Persian rule, Egypt was treated as a source of tribute and soldiers. The Persian dynasty, the 27th, was marked by absentee rulers who cared little for the land of the Nile. There were rebellions and brief moments of independence, but Persia always regained control, until a new conqueror came on the scene. The name of this conqueror would echo through the corridors of history, redefining the ancient world. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great marched into Egypt. Tired of the Persian yoke, the Egyptians hailed the young Macedonian king as a liberator. Alexander made a point of presenting himself as the legitimate successor to the pharaohs. He visited the Oracle of Amun in the Siwa oasis, where he was proclaimed the son of the god, and founded the city of Alexandria, which would become the intellectual center of the Hellenistic world. But Alexander never set foot in Egypt again. He left on his campaign to the east and died in 323 BC in Babylon, leaving his empire in dispute among his generals. Egypt would become the prize of one of his most ambitious commanders. Egypt fell to one of his most capable commanders, Ptolemy, son of Lagus. Ptolemy proclaimed himself pharaoh and founded the dynasty that would bear his name. The Ptolemaic dynasty was the last to rule Egypt. The Ptolemies were Greeks who adopted the robes and titles of the pharaohs. They built magnificent temples, such as those of Edfu, Dendera, and Philae, restored the economy, and sponsored art and science. The Library of Alexandria became the greatest center of knowledge in the ancient world, but it was a splendor built on shifting sands. However, a deep fissure ran through the Ptolemaic reign. The court spoke Greek, the administration was Greek, and the cultural elite was Greek. Most Egyptians, peasants of the Nile, priests of the ancient temples, never felt represented by these fair-skinned, blonde-haired sovereigns. In the eyes of the people, the Ptolemies were foreigners who, although they respected the gods, would never be true Egyptians. This latent tension frequently exploded in revolts and riots.
Egypt was a divided nation, ruled by a dynasty that did not belong to its soul. The Ptolemaic dynasty was corroded by a succession of assassinations, incest, and civil wars. The throne was brutally disputed between brothers and daughters, and diplomatic alliances often turned into deadly traps. While the Ptolemies self-destructed, a new power dominated the Mediterranean, Rome. The shadow of the Roman eagle loomed over Egypt. Initially, Rome and Egypt maintained diplomatic relations. But as Roman power expanded, Egypt became a burden to Rome, a patronage-based kingdom that needed the military support of the Senate to maintain itself. The Ptolemaic rulers, desperate to secure their throne, made concessions that increasingly undermined their independence. It was in this context of growing dependence that the last great figure in Egyptian history entered the scene. Cleopatra VII, daughter of Ptolemy XII, was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 3 centuries to take the trouble to learn the Egyptian language. Intelligent, educated, multilingual, and possessing a magnetic personality, Cleopatra understood, like few others, that the survival of her kingdom depended on her ability to play the political game of Rome. She was the personification of Egyptian hope, a queen who finally spoke the language of her people and embraced their gods. First, she seduced Julius Caesar, the Roman dictator, who had defeated his rival Pompey and was seeking allies in the east. Cleopatra and Caesar had a son, Caesarion, and she became a key piece in Caesar's plans for the east. But Caesar's assassination in 44 BC plunged Rome into a new civil war. The political chessboard had rearranged itself, and Cleopatra needed to find a new protector. Cleopatra saw an opportunity in Mark Antony, the powerful Roman general who ruled the eastern part of the empire. She allied herself with him, and together they formed a powerful political military bloc that rivaled Octavian, Caesar's heir in the west. Cleopatra and Mark Antony had a dream: to build an eastern empire that would challenge Rome, with Greece, Asia Minor, and Egypt as its centers. But this dream clashed with Octavian's cold ambition. What was at stake was not only the throne of Egypt, but the fate of the Western world. War was inevitable. In 31 BC, the fleets of Octavian and Mark Antony met at Actium, on the coast of Greece. The battle was a disaster for Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Their fleet was destroyed, and they were forced to flee back to Egypt. The end was near. When Octavian arrived in Alexandria, Mark Antony, believing Cleopatra to be dead, fell on his own sword. Cleopatra, seeing that she had no more allies and that she would be taken as a trophy to Rome, chose death. According to legend, she had herself bitten by an asp, the sacred snake that symbolized Egyptian divine royalty. Cleopatra died, the last pharaoh. With her death, Octavian, who would soon become Emperor Augustus, transformed Egypt into a Roman province. There would be no more kings, no more pharaohs. Egypt became the breadbasket of Rome, a source of grain to feed the metropolis and a subjugated land. The pharaonic history, which had begun with Narmer 3,000 years earlier, had come to an end. The last breath of the Nile dissipated into thin air. Despite the political end of the empire, we can say that Egypt as a civilization did not die immediately. The temples continued to function under Roman rule. The priests officiated their rituals for several more centuries. The Egyptian language evolved into Coptic, and many Egyptians converted to Christianity, which found fertile ground in Egypt. The iconography of Isis, the mother goddess, influenced the representation of Mary with the baby Jesus. Pharaonic amulets and symbols were adapted to the Coptic Christian faith. When Islam arrived in Egypt in the 7th century, the pharaonic religion finally died out, but the memory, the land, and the river remained. In 1822,
Jean-François Champollion deciphered the hieroglyphs using the Rosetta Stone, and the ancient world of Egypt spoke again. Monuments, temples, and tombs that had been silenced for centuries have revealed their stories, myths, and beliefs. Pharaonic Egypt, which seemed to have disappeared, has resurfaced from the sands, inviting us to understand it. So, how did ancient Egypt fall? It was not a single event. It was the product of a long process of attrition. It was the internal tensions between the power of the pharaoh and the wealth of the temples. It was the crushing burden of wars and monumental constructions. It was the invasions of the sea peoples, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. It was the transformation of the Mediterranean world, which went from a constellation of kingdoms to centralized empires. But above all, it was the collapse of a worldview. Egypt believed in eternity. It believed that its pharaoh was a god, and that cosmic order was ensured by the repetition of immutable rituals. When those certainties crumbled, when the pharaohs were murdered, when the tombs were desecrated, and the gods seemed to fall silent, the fabric of Egyptian society unraveled. Egypt was not destroyed, it transformed. It merged with Greece, with Rome, with Christianity, and with Islam. Each of these cultures absorbed and reinterpreted elements of the ancient civilization, keeping its essence alive, even in transformed forms. Today, when we look at the pyramids, the colossal statues, and the reliefs in the temples, we see what remains of that world. We marvel at its grandeur and tremble before its mystery. But we must also remember that the fall is not the end. It is a metamorphosis. Egypt's legacy is not buried in the sands. It lives on in our art, our religion, our architecture, and our philosophy. The Nile's last gasp echoes to this day, reminding us that even the most powerful civilizations are, in the end, as fragile as sand in the wind.